Charles Folkard was born in 1878 in Lewisham, London, the son of a merchant's clerk. In his later teens, he briefly attended St John's Wood School of Art and also took some evening classes at Goldsmiths College. But formal training didn't really suit him, and to all intents and purposes, he was essentially self-taught. Unlikely as it seems, he began his working life as a magician and acrobat using the name Professor Volkart, and he performed at parties and concerts, but with little meaningful success. And finally, realising that it was his talent for illustration which was more likely to earn him a living, he set about creating a portfolio of work, with which he managed to get sporadic commissions from magazines, of which I found absolutely no evidence. In 1907 he took a job as a staff artist with the Amalgamated Press, but he only lasted a couple of years with the company. But in 1910, at the age of 32, his illustrations for The Flint Heart, a fairy story written by Eden Philpotts, were published, and this was the first commission which successfully showcased his affinity for this genre, despite only being printed in tonal monochrome. The meticulous detail and imagination he brought to each of these absorbing scenes was a significant factor in the book's popular success. And not only was it favourably reviewed by many, including the New York Times, but Folkard's images were frequently singled out for critical praise. In the same year, his visualisation of Johann David Wyss's classic novel The Swiss Family Robinson was also published, and for this book Folkard was able to work in colour. Some years earlier he had met the already successful, slightly older Arthur Rackham, and Folkard's work undoubtedly owed a stylistic debt to Rackham and his use of expressive pen line embellished with tonal watercolour washes. But having said that, he was far from alone in this approach, and it would be far from easy to find anyone working in this arena at the time who didn't conform, at least in general terms, to this way of working. In 1911 he began a 27-year-long association with the publishers A&C Black, and in that year Folkard produced no less than 3 illustrated books for them. The Children's Shakespeare, retold with considerable editing by Alice Spencer Hoffman, contained more highly evocative pen and wash images by Folkard. He was evidently more comfortable with the plays involving fantasies such as The Tempest and A Midsummer Night's Dream, but there were others from the darker plays and even tragedies including Romeo and Juliet, which although competent enough didn't have similar levels of engagement for the viewer. The second book of that year was an edition of Carlo Collodi's Pinocchio, loosely translated and rewritten by M.A. Murray. Nevertheless, despite the narrative's occasional deviation from the original, Folkard's images were highly successful in their evocation of the frequently sinister and occasionally nightmarish nature of the original story. The watercolour pages positively burst with activity and somewhat grotesque characterisation, including Pinocchio himself. In addition to the colour pages, Folkard also created a collection of crisply rendered black and white pen and ink drawings of equal engagement. And like all Folkard's books by this point, it was a commercial success in Britain, continental Europe and the USA. His visualisation of the Tales of the Brothers Grimm, the third book of 1911, followed the same pattern, and it was another collection which provided him with an ideal opportunity to explore similar dark fantasy images. The monochromes in this book were created as chapter headings, and they were another set of accomplished and expressive pen and ink drawings masquerading quite plausibly as woodcuts. In the full colour pages, his obvious talent for scene setting was naturally enough well to the fore for this commission, and in the well-chosen moments he illustrated from each tale, he blended the innocence of younger protagonists, such as Little Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel, effectively with the more malevolent characters. A year later he was commissioned to illustrate a collection of fairy tales of Swedish origin, titled Jolly Callie and Other Stories. And it was further proof, if it was needed, that he and his publishers were working on the principle that the now established format of colour pages punctuated with monochrome chapter headings and spot illustrations was patently not broken and no fixing was required. And it met with identical success to those that had preceded it. He continued to work at what seems to have been an impossibly prodigious level, and the same year also saw the publication of Aesop's Fables, with some more eloquent scene setting and a generous helping of anthropomorphic character creation. There were only 8 colour illustrations in total in this book, but what they lacked in volume they made up for in quality and visual engagement. It's probably worth pointing out that this book and virtually every other he illustrated went on to be reprinted and even retitled numerous times during the course of his life and career. Folkard's prolific outpouring of fantasy illustration continued in 1913 with another 3 titles published. The Jackdaw of Reims, originally written by Thomas Ingoldsby in 1837, contained some pen and wash illustrations of Folkard's usual high standards, although the nature of the narrative didn't provide him with the opportunity to indulge his more imaginative character creation and scenic work. The Ring of the Nibelung, retold by P. Granville Edge, unfortunately only featured 4 colour illustrations, but the few he did create were suitably rousing in their evocation of the legend, and manifestly more within his comfort zone as a subject. But the major success of that year was undoubtedly Folkard's edition of the Arabian Nights, which contained some of his finest narrative images. The eye for oriental detail in the settings, clothing and props which populated the images gave this volume immense plausibility. Folkard was known to be a perfectionist, and he would apparently throw away completed full-colour illustrations and start again if he felt it wasn't up to scratch. Even in his more anatomically representational images of humans, he never used models, although he was known to enlist the assistance of various family members to pose, while he completed a quick gestural sketch to inform the final outcome. Nothing is written about it, but I can only imagine his backgrounds and scene setting were created from some form of observation and visual research, because they were always possessed with the ring of authenticity. The Great War began in 1914, and during the conflict not much publishing took place, but Folkard did publish one book at least, which was Ottoman Wonder Tales in 1915, so it's more than likely he had completed the project before hostilities began. It was a return to similar Middle Eastern themes to those in the Arabian Nights, although these illustrations were more overtly romantic, and the characters more representational anatomically than the more comedic and visually playful characters he had taken such delight in with the earlier book. In the same year he was invited by the Daily Mail newspaper to create a daily comic strip, and Folkard came up with the immediately popular mouse character Teddy Tail. But no sooner had he started to produce the stories than Folkard enlisted in the Artists' Rifles, alongside other contemporary visual creatives, during which time his brother Harry was employed to keep the strip going in his absence. But as it turned out, Charles was wounded in battle and was invalided out fairly quickly, and resumed his ownership of the strip, now considered to be one of the most influential and earliest to feature in a British daily newspaper. The success of Teddy Tail was enough to engender various spin-offs and merchandising, including syndication in the USA, annual, and inevitably a cuddly stuffed toy. Folkard himself stopped creating the strip in 1920, but it was taken up by others and continued to be published with enduring success in various formats up to the 1960s. The Mother Goose rhymes were among the most popular illustrated collections of the late 19th and early 20th century, and in 1919, with the war over, Folkard put his visual stamp on yet another. And however many other worthy additions there had been, he managed to create a highly entertaining and visually absorbing version. There was the usual collection of full-page illustrations, each of which captured a well-chosen moment from the narrative of the particular rhyme. And additionally, Folkard created a series of pages featuring engrossing vignetted spot illustrations, which were incorporated on the page in imaginative layouts with the relevant rhyme, and the results were arguably even more immersive for little readers. By this point, it would be fair to say that Folkard was entirely and presumably happily typecast as a fantasy narrative illustrator, working in the expected traditions of the Golden Age. And there were only a couple of others in Britain, such as Rackham, Dulac and Heath Robinson, who could claim equal or greater success. and in 1920 Folkard once more demonstrated his mastery of such material with the publication of British Fairy and Folk Tales, written by W.J. Glover. This was another accomplished collection of high-quality watercolour renders which depicted a range of fanciful scenarios, featuring both pretty and more comical, agreeably ugly characters for these lesser-known fairy tales. It was no surprise to anyone that a year later Folkard also joined the crowded ranks of those who sought to create their own visualisation of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, originally and most memorably brought to life by John Tenniel in 1865. But unlike the many other versions, this volume wasn't the actual narratives, but a visual interpretation of the various songs and verses taken from them. The illustrations were all technically full-page images, but the book actually used this decorative device around each one, and I've taken the liberty of showing them without to get them bigger on screen. All the expected roll call of characters featured, and like others, the debt owed to Tenniel was obvious. Nevertheless, there were plenty of Folkard's personal touches in evidence too. In 1922, The Magic Egg, written by Dorothy Black, was published, and for this project Folkard's illustrations were mostly precisely drawn pen and ink monochromes, an aspect of his work which had become otherwise quite sidelined, although I did find just one example of a painted piece printed with a limited earthy colour palette. In 1923 he published another book under the Mother Goose banner, in this case somewhat spuriously, as this time it was actually a collection of fairy tales drawn from various sources. He shared the illustration of the book with the even less remembered and not totally dissimilar J.H. Hartley, but however misleading the title of the book, Folkard was once more manifestly in his element and created a series of fine narrative moments of great distinction. It was then another 5 years before he created any new work, with The Troubles of a Gnome, translated from the original Polish for British and American readers. And although some of the images continued to use the identical method as his earlier work, many more in this book were patently exploring a flatter, opaque application of paint with considerably more contemporary modernist resonance, more in line with what was by this time becoming an increasingly Art Deco-influenced market. His characterisation remained the same, but this more graphic approach indicated a willingness on his part to bend with the winds of change. In 1930, a collection of smaller format books titled Black's Box of Books was published with well-known fairy tales illustrated by Folkard in the same flat, or at least almost flat, gouache-painted style. But when compared with his earlier more complex renders of the same tales, these images were conspicuously lacking in terms of their visual engagement. The Land of Nursery Rhyme by Alice Dalgleish and Ernest Rhys was published in 1932 and provided yet more evidence of his conversion to this more contemporary approach. His characters in the book were far more stylised than previously, although arguably every bit as attractive, and it was dominated by the decorative but formal use of modernist patterns and borders, with many flat two-colour pages, all of which were unrecognisable as the work of the creator of the Grimm's Tales and other illustrations from 2 decades earlier. And stranger still, following this dramatic change of technique, all evidence of his work appears to vanish until 1949. What he had been doing in the interim I have no idea, but in that year 2 more books, The Princess and the Goblin and The Princess and the Curdie, written originally by George MacDonald in 1872 and 1883 respectively, were published. And despite their manifestly golden age styling, every source I checked maintains that 1949 was in fact their first publication, rather than the later reprints I assumed them to be. He was by this point 71 years old and had clearly reverted to his earlier stylistic approach, and I struggle to think of a single illustrator who modernised briefly only to return to the more organic approach of their early career, particularly following an apparent absence of 2 decades. But there was no sign of declining abilities, and the colour pages of both were particularly dark and desaturated in their execution, and as ever his monochrome pen and drawings were clean and descriptive, and successfully kept the narrative going between the fewer full-page illustrations. Almost as mysteriously, 7 years later in 1956, he provided 8 new colour illustrations for the Book of Nonsense, a collection of absurd tales and rhymes from various sources, along with reprints from worthies including Tenniel and Lear. And Charles Folkard died at the age of 85 in Heathfield, Sussex, in 1963. He began his career fully formed as an accomplished pen and watercolour illustrator whose style and technical approach never so much as wavered until his entertaining defection to more modernist styling 2 decades later. And despite the overwhelming evidence that he returned to his original technique another 2 decades after that, I remain at least a little sceptical about the years of publication of the MacDonald stories. But ultimately it doesn't really matter when he created them, only that he did. More importantly, what isn't in doubt is that Charles Folkard's legacy has undoubtedly suffered from the massive shadow cast by some of his contemporaries. And as usual, I hope this video brings him greater attention and the respect he deserves.